People talk a lot about bias. This is the headline explanation for most decision-making flaws. Confirmation bias, overconfidence, hindsight bias, so on. You probably heard of it before. Bias gets the intention because it's systematic, predictable. You can identify it, name it, maybe even correct it. But there's another source of error that's just as damaging, and it usually gets ignored in mainstream finance discourse, which is noise. Noise is the variability in judgments that should be the same. When different people, or the same person on different days, produce different answers to the same question, that's noise. It's randomness in professional judgment. It's inconsistency masquerading as analysis. In fields like finance, where judgment under uncertainty is the job, noise is not just an annoyance but a hidden cost. It degrades decision quality, increases volatility, and generally creates inefficiencies that are invisible until they explode. So for example, take three underwriters that are assessing the same insurance application. One quotes a premium of 8,000, one says it's 12,000, the other says 5,000. Same case, same company, but wildly different outcomes. That spread is considered noise, and it's everywhere in stock picking, credit scoring, valuation, forecasting, investment committees, and even compliance reviews like an audit. The problem is that organizations tend to see bias as a fire to put out and ignore noise because it's silent. You can't really see its damages. But if you're trying to improve decision making in a real world financial context, noise may be doing more damage than bias, precisely because it's less obvious. For example, in valuation and analyst forecasts, you can ask 10 equity analysts to value a company even using the same DCF framework, and you get 10 different numbers, and sometimes they're radically different. Part of that is bias, of course, different assumptions or priors or certain personality quirks, but a lot of it is noise, difference in judgments about future growth, discount rates, competitive advantage, margin profiles. None of that is precise. It's technically guesswork in Excel. Markets price securities based on that forecast of analysts. So noise in the analyst estimates translates to noise in stock prices, of course. That creates volatility that isn't tied to fundamentals, just inconsistencies in how people interpret the fundamentals. The next example, of course, is credit ratings and risk models. Credit rating agencies pride themselves on analytical rigor, of course, but studies have shown that if you give the same case to different analysts, even within the same agency, the assigned rating can vary significantly. Again, this isn't bias, it's inconsistency, human judgment injected into a process that should be replicable. The same goes for internal risk models at banks or funds. Different teams using similar models will output different risk assessments, even for similar portfolios. The judgment component, how inputs are selected, interpreted, and weighted, introduces a lot of noise that makes the model unstable across users. So you could literally have the same user, the same portfolio, but get different credit ratings. And lastly, let's look at investment committees and fund selection. Ask 5 people to rate a fund manager or improve your investment strategy, and you get 5 subtly different answers. In theory, a well-designed investment committee should reduce the variability in judgment. This is because people are, of course, different. People are exposed to different sorts of biases but are resistant in others. So you're able to aggregate the biases of the 5 and come to a better result by consensus. In theory, this is a good idea, but in practice, it often makes it worse. You usually get groupthink, anchoring, social pressure, status dynamics, all of which add noise, not reduce it. One person might be swayed by the track record more than the other. The another might be by narrative, maybe another by reputation. People become intellectually dishonest, so same inputs, different outputs. That's noise in professional judgment. So I've talked about noise and why it's dangerous, but how do we reduce noise? The solution to noise isn't to trust human judgment more, it's to recognize its limits and to engineer systems that reduce the variability where consistency matters. So here's some practical methods. The most important one is decision hygiene. This is about getting better data, it's about getting a better process about making judgments. Decision hygiene refers to structured methods that reduce variability in how judgments are formed. For instance, there could be protocols where instead of free-form analysis, we can use decision templates or scorecards that guide thinking and weigh in key variables. The second could be independent assessments before group discussion, especially because of groupthink. When you get an opinion from somebody and then that subtly affects your opinion whether we realize it or not. People must sit with the data at first without accessing information from each other or collaborating so that groupthink doesn't occur. Third, of course, is noise audits. You can audit the noise or get the judgments in from different people. That way you can actually measure the amount of noise in the judgment. If different people rate the same input differently, that's measurable noise and could be fixable. Next one could be the use of models. Algorithms don't get tired, emotional, or swayed by irrelevant details, so even simple rules can outperform expert judgment when applied consistently. So this doesn't mean turning everything over to machines. If you go over to the subjective value lectures, it actually says the opposite. but it means letting models handle repeatable structured decisions and using human input only where needed. For example, when you do underwriting, you use a checklist. If you want to go for hiring or manager selection, you use a regression weighted model. And if you wanted to go performance evaluation, you must use it under objective metrics rather than subjective metrics. People resist this because they overestimate their ability to make nuanced decisions. But data shows that consistent rules often beat experts, especially in noisy domains. Over a long enough time period, you're able to check how much of it is deterred by noise or by bias. Judgment isn't sacred, it's an input, and it should be measured like a data point. When talking about reducing noise, it reveals the deeper tension in how institutions manage decision making. Should you reduce noise using rules or by standards? So, of course, rules are fixed, they are clear, repeatable, they aim for consistency, even at the cost of flexibility, but standards are sort of vague. They allow interpretation, they kind of aim for nuance, but they are more inconsistent in judgment. So rules are practically like a small circle, while standards are a rubber band of acceptable judgment. Professionals love standards because they preserve discretion, but that's exactly where noise comes in. Two people interpreting the same standard can reach different outcomes, not because one is wrong, but because the standard is underspecified in a certain sort of action. For example, take reasonable risk as a compliance standard. One reviewer might see a strategy as aggressive but compliant, another might flag it. That's noise. Rules, by contrast, reduce that variability. They don't always yield perfect outcomes, especially if the rules are tone deaf, but they are predictable. You can design systems around them. This applies to everything from trading policies to bonus frameworks. If you want fairness, transparency, and reduced friction, you lean towards rules. But if you want interpretation and discretion, accept that you're inviting noise and plan how to minimize it into a controllable level. The key, of course, isn't to say rules is better than standards or to eliminate standards, is to recognize where rules are more appropriate, especially in high stakes or high frequency decisions where consistency is critical. So in conclusion, bias makes bad decisions predictable. Noise makes them unpredictable. Both, of course, are dangerous, but noise is harder to detect, harder to fix, and more corrosive to institutional trust. So if you want sharper investment processes, or better hiring, or even cleaner forecasting, you should fix the noise. Structure decision making, use models where necessary, and treat consistency not as an optional virtue, but as something that is mandatory.